that those individuals who are here have come to study your word and to participate in Sunday school. Lord, I pray as we open the book that we would look into it, we would glean from it, it would be helpful and applicable in our life, as we normally say, Lord. Lord, I pray as we begin to study and come to the conclusion of Acts, that even though we hold Paul on this high pedestal as this apostle and all the amazing things he did, we can see the human side of him and realize that, in fact, he was a normal man used by God. And if we apply in our life those things that we learn and we allow you to work in our life, Lord, we can also have similar application and similar effect to those around us as we walk on this world. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, so Acts chapter 23 today. Acts chapter 23. We'll do our introduction and then we'll read the text. So again, we're 5 chapters to the end of Acts here. So we are nearing the death of Paul. Spoiler alert, right? That's what's going to happen. He's going to go to Rome. He's going to stand trial in Rome and all these things. And we'll get there in a couple chapters. But we have to remember what he's doing, who's writing this book, and why they're writing it, right? So as always on our intro, this book is written by Luke. He wrote quite a bit of the New Testament, and he's writing it to this guy Theophilus, which I was reading another commentary this week about who this guy was, and again, they kind of double down on this idea that he was actually a Roman nobleman who Luke was employed by, and he was actually his personal physician, who then, when Theophilus found out about what was happening in the day of Pentecost and all these things that were going on, he actually sent Luke to find out. So that's where we are. That's who we're writing to and who wrote the book. This book is written around AD 65. So this is 30, 35, 40 years, depending on what timeline you look at, after the death of Christ. But what we'll notice in today's chapter is we're going to see some similar names, aka one being a high priest called Ananias. It's a similar name, but not the same person. So just remember that so we're not confused on our timelines here. So, who's Luke? He's the Gentile. He's the beloved physician. He's the fellow laborer. And as we read Acts, you'll, again, like we always say, and we've been saying for a while now, you'll notice a transition in certain chapters. We were doing this. We went here. We sailed here. We took this boat. We did these things. And then it'll transition all of a sudden. They did these things. It's because Luke is traveling and working with Paul and the others in the gospel, but then staying at Philippi for a short amount of time while Paul goes and does something else. Then he catches up with them. Right? So there's this kind of dropping off and catching up points through the different chapters of Acts, which is why we get the we and them, they and us kind of mixed in, intermingled. So, is that big enough on the screen? Sort of. So this is the third missionary journey of Paul, and we've completed this coming up through Acts chapter 21 and 22. It's important to know that we're in Jerusalem, so we're down here at this bottom this bottom section down here in Jerusalem this week, and we're getting ready to travel from Jerusalem up to Caesarea Maritime, which is on the coast just south of Joppa. Some things that we should know is obviously Jerusalem is under Roman control. So is Caesarea, right? This whole area is under Roman control. They've got certain people working and running those territories, either Roman noblemen or proconsulars or whatever you want to call them, kind of running these areas. Today we're going to see a guy named Felix who's running the territory based out of Caesarea. Caesarea, this little town here, was the center of Roman occupation and the center of Roman control. It was not Jerusalem. So when things got to a certain level, like this trial for Paul, and they wanted to take it to the Roman government, it got escalated to the Roman province that was under control in Caesarea. That was the seat of the government. And we see a stop-off point on the way up there this week. Again, as just a reminder, we've got to remember that all of this happened, these missionary journeys. Paul's been working in the missionary field for 25 to 27 years. So he's coming to the completion of a 27-year missionary work, has told those that he's left in certain cities, you'll never see me again. I will to go to Rome. Right? He gets told by Agabus last week that if you go to Jerusalem, you're going to get bound and taken. Right? Agabus took Paul's girdle off, his belt off, and bound his hands and said, this is what's going to happen to the man that wears this girdle, and Paul went anyway. And that real shift was, we saw Paul in Acts chapter 17 saying, I'm scared, I'm nervous. The Lord shows up to him in a dream and says, don't be scared. I'm going to be with you. You're going to have my protection and my presence and my plan in your life. And that was because Paul didn't know what was going to happen in the cities that he went to. He was concerned something bad could happen or the message wouldn't be received. And what we saw last week was this transition to Paul not being afraid, even though he knew he was going to die. So this growth in his Christian life, even though he is the amazing Apostle Paul and doing all these great things, he was scared and he was nervous. And as he even gets through his missionary work, being in it 27 years, he's still growing and learning to say, okay, God, I'm nervous about the unknown. The Lord comes to him, and now he's not nervous about the known. He knows he's going to die, right? So that's that transition that we've seen over these last few chapters. And again, he was seen in Jerusalem, in the Temple Mount, right? The Jews got mad at him because they thought he was bringing in non-Jews into the central temple, defiling the temple. So they're beating him up, and the Roman guard has kind of taken him, and they've taken him to that castle or the Roman barracks that we saw last week, and that's where we're picking up. So if we finish, if I read verse 29 of Acts 22, we've already done that. So verse 29 in Acts 22 says, then straightway they departed from him, which should have examined him, and the chief captain also was afraid, after he knew that he was a Roman, and because he had bound him. This is this guy Claudius realizing Paul's a Roman citizen when he was going to scourge him, and they've stopped, right? And he's made a decision, and the decision is in Acts 22 verse 30. On the morrow, because he would have known the certainty whereof he was accused of the Jews, that's Paul, he's loosed Paul from his bands, and commanded the chief priests and all their council to appear, and brought Paul down and set him before them. So this captain of the Roman guard, who we don't know his name yet, we'll learn his name in Acts chapter 23, has said, I'm not sure what's going on, but I can't beat you to try to get a confession out of you because you're a Roman citizen. I'm scared that I'll be put to death. So what I'm going to do is call the Sanhedrin together, that council of the elders of the Jews, and I'm going to put you in front of them and see what kind of happens. And that's what we pick up here on chapter 23. What we have to remember is the time and place. Right? We're under Roman control of Jerusalem. We're still on the Temple Mount. Right? Where we started was Paul trying to preach and not preach. He was doing his Nazirite vow with those 4 individuals here in the inner court. Right? The Jews recognized him. They drug him out to the court of the Jewish women, the women's court here. They were beating him up, nearly put him to death. The Roman guard find out about it, and then they drag him here into the court of the Gentiles, which is his much bigger court. They take possession of him. The Roman guard take possession of him, and they take him over to that fortress or those soldier barracks that are on the edge of the Temple Mount. That's what they looked like. So they've taken him out of this court of the Gentiles over here to this fortress. I'm trying to remember the name of the fortress. I've got it in some other notes. I apologize, I can't remember it. So they're keeping him here. And then if we remember in Acts 22, Paul is also preaching and giving his testimony on these steps here outside the barracks. So on the morning, the Sanhedrin have been come together. There's 71 individuals of the Sanhedrin. This is the Jewish elite, both Pharisee and Sadducee. They've got the high priest, which is the one. So there's 70, and then the one, which is the high priest. And Paul is going to go to trial there. So that's where we pick up in chapter 23 and verse number 1. And Paul, earnestly beholding the council. So now he's standing in front of the council. This would be him. Here's Paul. Here's the setup for the Sanhedrin. Here's the high priest. What you need to remember, if you can see this little drawing down here, you see that little red corner dot? It's kind of hard to see. The Sanhedrin courtroom was on the Temple Mount. It was here, outside of the actual sanctuary. So they had this marble kind of stone room set up where they would hold court and hold judgment. And that's where this diagram is taking place, here inside the Temple Mount. So Paul's here, he's standing up in front of the court, and he's giving he's going to rebut the accusations against him. So here we are. And Paul, verse 1, and Paul, earnestly beholding the council, said, Men and brethren, have I lived in all good conscience before God until this day. And the high priest Ananias commanded them that stood by him to smite him on the mouth. So this is a similar name, Ananias, but a different high priest. This high priest was around AD 46 to AD 56 and 60 before he was put to death. So Ananias, the high priest, tells the guy standing next to Paul, right here, the accused, to punch him in the face. That's what happens. Then said Paul unto him, God shall smite thee, thou whiteth wall, for sittest thou to judge me after the law, and commandest me to be smitten contrary to the law. Levitical law says you can't punish a prisoner until they're proven guilty. Right? So he's administered a punishment before judgment. Verse number 4, and they that stood by said, Revilest thou God's high priest? Right? Paul, why would you talk to the high priest like this? Verse number 5, then said Paul, I wist not, brethren, that he was the high priest, or I didn't know that he was the high priest. For it is written, Thou shalt not speak evil of the ruler of the people. And that is from Exodus 22:28. So Paul, now there's two ways to look at this. Paul now either realizes that this is the high priest, which is highly unlikely because the high priest sat in the same spot every time and wore special clothing. Or Paul said, I didn't know he was the high priest because he wasn't appointed by God. Right? In this time frame, Ananias, the high priest of the Jews in the Sanhedrin, was put in place by the Roman guard, by the Roman government. And he was put there to be able to control the Jewish population. Right? It was a crowd control technique. He wasn't a true high priest. He was been put there by the Roman guard. So he's done a favor to Rome, to Caesar, and said, if you'll put me in as the high priest, I'll keep the quiet. I'll make everybody happy. We'll follow Roman lead. And I'll kind of keep the Sanhedrin in line. So they put this guy in place. And Paul is saying to him, are you really the high priest? Because to me, you're a whiteth wall, right? You say one thing, but you do something different. And in fact, I didn't even know it was you because I don't think you're the real high priest. Verse number 6, but when Paul perceived that one part of the Sadducees and the other part Pharisees, he cried out in the council, and men and brethren, I am a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee, of the hope and resurrection of the dead, I am called in question. We've got to remember the two sects of the Sanhedrin. So if we look at the picture, let's imagine on the right and then on the left, you've got two different factions of Jewish belief. One is the Pharisees. Pharisees believed in a full belief of the Pentateuch, which is the first 5 books of the Bible, but also the oral law given by Moses. They believed in angels, and they also believed in resurrection of the dead. And the Pharisees were not the ruling elite. They were the belief of the common people. Right? They were raised in a certain manner. They dressed a certain way, and they believed in everything that was told to them about the Old Testament and about Moses. And then on the left, you had the Sadducees. The Sadducees were the liberal elite. Okay, they had all the money, they had all of the control, and they believed in a literal translation of only the Pentateuch. They didn't believe in resurrection, they didn't believe in angels, they didn't believe in miracles, they didn't believe in any of this. So you've got this rift between the Jewish Sanhedrin. On the left, you've got one side, on the right, you've got the other. Paul realizes that he's not going to get a fair trial because he just got smacked in the mouth by the high priest. So what's he do? He plays on that separation and says, I'm a Pharisee of a Pharisee. Right? Which means I believe in angels and healing and resurrection. And in fact, here in verse number 6, he says, and that's why I'm in front of you. I'm in front of you because I say Jesus was raised from the dead. And I'm in front of you because you don't believe that that happened and that you think it's contrary or blasphemy against God. So he's calling out to say, actually, Pharisees do believe these things. So verse number 7 begins, and when he had said so, there arose a dissension between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the multitude was divided. So he's put this riff and he's called it out, saying, this is why I'm in front of you. One side against the other. Let's hear it out. Verse number 8, for the Sadducees say that there is no resurrection, neither angel nor spirit, but the Pharisees confess both. Verse number 9, and there arose a great cry, and the scribes that were with the Pharisees arose and strove, and saying, we find no evil in this man, but if a spirit or an angel has spoken to him, let us not fight against God. So now the Pharisees are on Paul's side. They say, actually, you know what? There's no judgment to be had here. This should be over with. Verse number 10. And when there arose a great dissension, the chief captain, fearing lest Paul should have been pulled to pieces of them, commanded the soldiers to go down and take him by force from among them, and to bring him into the castle. So here's Paul. He's in the middle of the Sanhedrin. He's giving his testimony or his rebuttal against his judgment. Right? He's got these 70 members, these 70 elders, and this one high priest. This guy Ananias is sitting up there as the high priest. And it gets so in disarray because of what he said about resurrection. Sadducees believe that it cannot happen so fervently, and the Pharisees believe it can happen so fervently that they're fighting. In fact, the Roman guard is afraid Paul is going to be damaged or put to death in amongst this fighting, and they're going to get in trouble. So they go down and they get him. Okay? And then he begins and they take him back into that fortress on the edge of the Temple Mount. Verse number 11. And the night following, the Lord stood by him, the Lord stood by Paul, and said, Be of good cheer, Paul, for as thou hast testified of men in Jerusalem, so must thou bear witness also at Rome. Verse number 11 is a key verse in this chapter because it demonstrates a couple things. The who, the what, the when, the where, and the how for Paul and God's work in Paul's life. Right? When does the Lord show up and literally stand by Paul at the night when he's feeling the worst? He's trying to get a fair judgment. He's trying to deliver a testimony. He's being discouraged, and the Lord shows up to support him. Right? Who is it? It's the Lord himself, not an angel of the Lord. Right? Not a messenger, not a prophet. The Lord is literally, if we read verse number 11, and the night following, but the Lord stood by him. Paul is sitting down. The Lord is standing right beside him in his presence. Right? It's beside him. It's not near him. It's not far off. It's beside him. He's going to be there and to support him. He tells him to be of good cheer. Don't be disappointed by what's happening. It's all part of my plan, and my plan for you in your life is to go to Rome and to testify. Right? So he's feeling better. He's going to be of good cheer and also to witness into Rome. In verse number 12, and when it was day, certain of the Jews banded together and bound themselves under a curse, saying that they would neither eat nor drink till they had killed Paul. And when they were more than 40 which had made this conspiracy or this vow, and they came unto the chief priests and elders and said, We have bound ourselves under a great curse, and that we will eat nothing until we have slain Paul. Now therefore ye with the council signify the chief captain that he is to bring him down unto tomorrow, and though he would inquire something more perfectly concerning him. So he's saying, ask, hey, high priest Ananias and you guys, ask the captain to bring him down so we can put him on trial again to kind of clear up this matter. Right? We want to examine him some more, and that's what's going to happen. We're going to have this ploy to bring him down. Wherever he come near, we're ready to kill him. Verse number 16. When Paul's sister's son heard of their lying in wait, he went and entered into the castle and told Paul. This is the first mention of Paul's family other than saying Paul is from a Pharisee family. We now know Paul has a sister and also that he has a nephew. This is an interesting thing to think about because Paul has left his family belief of being a Jew and a Pharisee to trust in Jesus Christ for his salvation and to believe in the resurrection, right? To know that the law is a schoolmaster, but guiding him people to Christ, right? So he's kind of left his upbringing about being a Jew to say God has delivered Jesus Christ to the earth. He is the Messiah. We're not waiting any longer, right? Now, in most cases, your family would cut you off, right? If you say that and you're a Pharisee and your family believes something different, they would not allow you to be near them and they would cut off all ties with you. But here we learn Paul's got a sister and also his nephew is actually going to try to help him and protect him, which is an interesting thing to think about. Verse number 17, Then Paul called one of the centurions unto him and said, Bring this young man unto the chief captain, for he hath a certain thing to tell him. Verse 18, So he took him and brought him for the chief captain and said, Paul, the prisoner called me unto him and prayed me, Bring this young man unto thee, who hath something to say unto thee. Then the chief captain took him by the hand, that's the young boy, Paul's nephew, and went with him aside privately and asked him, What is that thou hast to tell me? Verse 20, and he said, The Jews have agreed to desire thee that thou wouldest bring down Paul tomorrow unto the council, that's in front of the Sanhedrin, and now that they would inquire somewhat him more perfectly and more completely. Verse 21, But do not thou yield unto them, for there lie in wait for him, and them more than 40 men which have bound themselves with an oath, that they will neither eat nor drink till they have killed him. nor are they ready, looking for a promise from thee. Verse 22, so the chief captain then let the young man depart, and charged him, see thou tell no man that thou hast showed these things unto me. So now the chief captain is aware that these over 40 Jews are lying in wait to kill Paul, and he's going to make a plan to get him out of town. Verse 23, and he called unto him 2 centurions, saying, make ready 200 soldiers to go to Caesarea. That's the place we looked at on the map earlier. And the horsemen 70, and the spearmen 200, and at the 3rd hour of the night. So he's got 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, and 200 spearmen. 470 individuals that are going to take Paul out of the city the 3rd hour of the night. Night began at 6 p.m. This is 9 p.m. at night. Verse 24, and provide them beasts that they may set Paul on, and bring him safe unto Felix the governor. Felix is the Roman governor of the province. He's based in Caesarea. So that's where they're headed to. Verse 25, and he wrote a letter after this manner. Claudius Lysias, unto the most excellent governor Felix, sendeth greeting. So Claudius Lysias is this Roman captain of the Roman guard in Jerusalem. That's this captain we've been reading about through this entire chapter. Verse 27, this man, Paul, was taken of the Jews and should have been killed of them. Then came I with an army and rescued him, having understood that he was a Roman. Think about that story. So Paul's getting beat on the Temple Mount, outside of the temple. The Roman guard, the chief captain, takes him, picks him up, takes him to the barracks, and is going to scourge him until Paul tells him that he's a Roman citizen. That's what happened in chapter 22. But Claudius writes a little bit of a different story here to Felix, the governor. He says, this man was taken of the Jews and should have been killed of them. Then came I with an army and rescued him, having understood that he was a Roman. That's a little bit of a turn on the truth right here. He's covering his own hind end here to make sure he doesn't get in trouble by Felix. Verse 28, and when I would have known the cause wherefore it accused him, I brought him forth into their council, whom I perceived to be accused of questions of their law, but to have nothing laid to his charge worthy of death or bonds. And when it was told me how that the Jews laid wait for the man, I sent straightway to thee, and gave commandment to his accusers also to say before thee what they had against him. Farewell. So, Felix, I'm Claudius, I'm sending this guy, this is what happened. He's going to come up to you because he needs to go on trial as a Roman citizen, and I'm going to send his accusers up later on, and you guys can have a trial up there. That's what we just heard about in this letter. Verse 31, then the soldiers, as it was commanded them, took Paul and brought him by night to Antipatris. So, let's do this. So, here we are. We're in Jerusalem. It's 9 p.m. We got 470 guards and a bunch of horses, and we're going to go up to Antipatris, which is halfway, just about halfway, to Caesarea. So here we've left Jerusalem. It's 9. It's like, I think it's 55 miles, give or take. It's 9 p.m. We're on the horses, and we're headed up here to Antipatris, halfway up. And that's where we are in verse 31. Verse 32, on the morrow they left the horsemen to go with, and returned to the castle. So half of the guard come back to the castle in Jerusalem, and the rest take him on up to Caesarea. Who, when they came to Caesarea and delivered the epistle to the governor, presented Paul also before him. And when the governor had read the letter, he asked of what province he was. And when he understood that he was from Cilicia, I will hear thee, said he, when thine accusers are also come, and they commanded him to be kept in Herod's judgment hall. So Felix does something interesting when he receives him. He says, are you a Roman citizen? He says, yes, I am. He says, where are you from? The first thing he does is he tries to understand, should I be involved in this annoying circumstance? And he says, I'm from Cilicia, right? So Cilicia, I don't have the map up here, but if we remember, is modern-day Turkey. That was part of Felix, the governor, the proconsul, that was part of his jurisdiction. So the first thing he does is make sure, hey, does this fall within my jurisdiction? Are you a Roman citizen of what I control? And he says, he understands that he is, so he puts him in holding in the judgment hall, and he's going to wait for the accusers to come up. That's where we leave off, right? So we're waiting for this trial at Felix in Caesarea Maritime to begin, right? So we've got to remember that Paul is struggling in his Christian walk. He's trying to do what's right. He's given his all to God. He's saying, Lord, where you will, I will go. But he continues to be kind of literally smacked in the face every time he tries to do what's right. For example, the high priest, right? Ananias. And what we can really see is we begin to see the human nature of Paul and how even though he's growing in Christ on his Christian walk, and he used to be scared of the unknown, I don't know if I'll be put to death or not. Now he knows what's going to happen, but he's still discouraged in that his testimony and his preaching isn't being received by those around him. Right? He's standing in front of the Sanhedrin, this 71-member council, and he is trying to testify and tell them, Jesus is the Messiah that we've read about in the Old Testament. You should receive him. He's trying to give them the gospel, and he's getting discouraged because nobody's receiving it. So even if you're Paul, you get discouraged in your Christian walk, and that's what we're seeing here with Paul. That's why the Lord shows up, stands by him, and says, be of good cheer. We got big work. We got big plans ahead of us. You got to continue on the path, right? So when in doubt, what will she look for? The who, what, when, where, and how. Who's going to come and help me? Oh, it's always going to be the Lord, right? Where's it going to be? He's always going to be beside me. The question is, where's it going to lead and how's it going to happen? We don't always know. So we've got to take that step of faith into this space, right? Like we talked about before, when Paul was in Macedonia, he wasn't in Macedonia yet. He was in Phoenicia, and he was trying to go to Macedonia, and he wanted to go north and he wanted to go south. Sometimes we feel like in our Christian walk, it's like we're trying to open a door that's locked. Right? Our job as Christians is to say, okay, Lord, I'm ready to serve and ready to work for you. Should I be doing something like this? If we try and the Lord rebuts us and says, no, we shouldn't be doing that yet. There's something else we should be doing. Our job is to listen to the will of God and then continue how he wants us. Not to kick down the door that we want to open to do the service that we want to do. Right? So we need to be sensitive to that. And then lastly, no matter our standing in our ministry, we're always faced with battles. If Paul was faced with battles, we'll be faced with battles. And he's an example for us in our Christian walk. We gotta keep up the fight, keep up the good work, right? Because if we look back at Paul's life, every time so far, the Lord has delivered him. From preaching in synagogues, to being stoned and bringing him back to life, to allowing him to have apostles and meet certain people in certain places along the way to support him and help him, right? The Lord allowed him to meet people where he could be a tent maker, which was his workmanship, so that he could make money to support himself, right? All through Paul's life, all the last 27 years of his ministry, we see how the Lord has supported him and guided him along the way. He's not going to get to the end of his life and then the Lord not support him anymore. Just like in our Christian walk. We haven't come so far that for the next battle, the Lord's not going to show up for us. It doesn't work like that. Right? And we're going to see Paul on trial here in Caesarea. And then as we finish out the book of Acts, we're going to see him get his wish fulfilled, which is to go to Rome and spread the gospel there. So we'll pick up next week in Acts chapter 24. All right? Lord, we love you. Again, we're thankful for this day. Sometimes it's hard, but we're also thankful for the rain. We need it. We need the rain. We need the sunshine. Lord, I pray you'd come down and touch us and help us, that we would not be discouraged in our battles, that we could look to Paul as an example for how to keep up the faith, continue the walk, and to realize there's no superhuman Christians, Lord. Everybody gets discouraged. Everybody struggles sometimes in their Christian walk. But we should trust that you will always be there to help us and support us, and that we have great examples like Paul that we could rely on and look to for guidance and support and examples. In Jesus' name, amen.